The tall stranger paid the price and led her where the river could forgive. The town was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that feels almost alive. A thin layer of mist hung over the river, softening the edges of the wooden houses and the cobbled streets. Birds sang gently, their songs echoing against the riverbank. The townspeople were slowly stirring, pulling themselves from sleep, lighting fires and opening shop doors, unaware that this day would bring someone new, someone who would quietly change the lives around him. No one noticed the first footprints on the edge of the town. They were long, careful, deliberate, belonging to a man who walked with a kind of silence that made him seem almost part of the mist. He was tall, taller than most men anyone in town had seen, with broad shoulders that seemed strong but not aggressive. His coat was worn and slightly tattered, but it had been cleaned with care. His boots were dusty, as if he had traveled a long way without resting. Yet his eyes, dark and observant, scanned everything, the river, the houses, the people, even the smallest details that most would miss. He paused at the riverbank, where the water moved slowly, curling around rocks and reeds. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, simply watching. It was as if the river spoke to him, whispered stories of loss and healing, of mistakes made and chances to make things right. He did not speak to anyone. He simply watched. The townspeople began to notice him soon enough. The blacksmith, leaning on his hammer at the open door of his shop, was the first to speak. "Who's that?" he asked the baker beside him, nodding toward the tall man standing by the river. "I don't know," the baker replied. "Never seen him before." "He's quiet, isn't he?" The stranger did not hear them. He did not look at them. He seemed to belong more to the river than to the town itself. Further along, on the wooden steps that led down to the river, sat a young woman. Her clothes were simple, plain, and her hair was tied back loosely, but her eyes carried a weight far heavier than her years. She stared at the water, unmoving, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every now and then she would reach out to touch the surface of the river, letting her fingers brush the cool water, and then withdraw them as if afraid the river would take more than she was willing to give. The tall stranger noticed her immediately. There was something in the way she sat, fragile yet stubborn, sorrowful yet searching, that drew his attention. He did not approach her right away. Instead, he moved a little closer, still careful to keep his distance, as though he wanted to understand her world before becoming part of it. The young woman sensed him after a while. Perhaps it was the change in the sound of the wind, or the soft crunch of his boots against the stones. She turned her head slightly but did not rise. There was a hint of curiosity in her eyes, mixed with caution. People in the town often whispered about strangers, about men who arrived without explanation, and she was no different. Yet there was no fear in her gaze, only the quiet question of whether he was different from the rest, whether he had come with kindness or only trouble. The stranger, sensing her scrutiny, finally nodded slightly, a gesture that was almost invisible but carried a weight of respect. He began to settle into the rhythm of the town, not with words but with small actions. He helped the fishermen untangle nets without asking for anything in return. He carried a bundle of wood for an elderly woman, carefully stacking it for her, before quietly moving on. He did not speak much, but when he did, his words were measured, deliberate, and kind. It was as if he spoke only when it truly mattered. The young woman watched him in silence. She did not yet understand why, but something in the way he moved, in the way he carried himself, made her heart a little lighter. For the first time in months, she felt a small crack in the walls she had built around herself. Despite his quiet presence, whispers began to travel through the town. Some spoke of his height, his strange silence, the feeling that he carried a heavy burden. Others speculated about his past, imagining stories of crime or loss. But no one knew the truth, and perhaps the stranger did not wish them to know. He had arrived not to make a statement, not to demand attention, but to quietly exist, and in time to help someone heal without drawing the eyes of the world. Days passed, and a subtle routine began to form. The stranger could often be found at the river in the early morning, sometimes helping to repair a broken boat, sometimes simply watching the water move. The young woman continued her visits, sometimes sitting in silence, sometimes speaking softly to him, asking questions that seemed small but carried weight. They spoke of the river, of the birds, of the way sunlight glinted on the water. Little by little she began to trust him, and he began to trust her. But the stranger's past was not idle. It was a shadow that followed him, quiet but persistent, though he never spoke of it openly. There were times when his eyes darkened with memory, when his hands trembled for a fraction of a second, and when his silence grew heavier than usual. He had made mistakes. Mistakes that had cost him more than anyone could measure. Mistakes that had left scars both visible and invisible. And now, in this quiet town by the forgiving river, he sought not to erase those mistakes, for they could never be erased, but to atone for them in ways that mattered. One afternoon, the young woman finally asked him hesitantly, "Why are you here?" He looked at her, the corners of his mouth turning down ever so slightly. "I came because I needed to be somewhere," he said softly. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere that allowed mistakes to be remembered but not to live forever." She nodded slowly, understanding more than his words conveyed. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the river, feeling the gentle pull of the water over the rocks. In that silence there was comfort. In that silence there was the unspoken acknowledgement that life had been hard for both of them, and yet there was a chance, however small, to move forward. Evening came and the town's lights flickered on, casting long shadows along the cobblestones. The stranger walked slowly back through the streets, noticing small things. The children playing with sticks, the smell of fresh bread, the way an old man leaned on his cane and smiled at a passing dog. He carried no gifts, no promises, only the quiet intention to exist honestly and to let the river and time do the rest. The young woman remained by the river a little longer, watching his figure disappear into the distance. She felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. She was beginning to understand that this tall stranger, with his quiet ways and careful presence, might not just be passing through. He might be here to show her something she had not been able to see for herself, a way to forgive, a way to let the river take the sorrow that had weighed on her for so long. And so, as the mist rolled in again over the river that night, the town slept, unaware that a story had begun. One of redemption, quiet courage, and the slow, patient work of healing. The stranger had arrived, carrying the weight of his past, and had noticed her, carrying the weight of her own. In their meeting, under the watchful eye of the forgiving river, something delicate and important had begun. Something that neither time nor circumstance could easily undo. By the end of the week, a rhythm had settled in. The townspeople, while still curious, began to accept him as part of the quiet life around the river. The young woman, too, began to feel a shift within herself, small but unmistakable. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps the river could forgive, that perhaps people could change, and that perhaps even mistakes carried within them the seed of something better. The tall stranger paid attention to the small things, the curve of a branch, the ripple of water against stone, the way the sunlight caught the edges of the clouds. But more importantly, he paid attention to her, without expectation, without pressure. And in that quiet attention, a fragile bridge began to form, one that would carry both of them toward understanding, toward healing, and toward the place where the river could finally forgive. The days that followed the stranger's arrival were quiet, but they carried a weight that the townspeople could not understand. Life went on in its usual rhythms. The blacksmith hammered his iron, the baker kneaded his dough, and children ran along the cobbled streets. But there was a subtle change in the air. The tall stranger moved among them with his calm presence, never drawing attention, yet somehow making people notice the world in a new way. The young woman found herself thinking about him more than she cared to admit. She had never trusted strangers easily, but there was something about his quiet, measured manner that made her feel safe. Sometimes she would linger at the river for longer than necessary, hoping to catch a glimpse of him as he worked on the boats or simply stared at the water. Their conversations were still cautious, polite at first, but slowly they began to share small pieces of themselves. It was on a late afternoon that the stranger first spoke of his past, not directly, not in great detail, but in the way he looked at the river. He said nothing of names or places, only fragments that carried meaning. "Sometimes," he said softly, his eyes following the flow of the water, "we carry things with us that we cannot put down. Mistakes, regret, choices that we wish we could undo. The young woman listened, leaning slightly against the wooden railing by the riverbank. She could feel the weight in his words because she carried her own burden. Months ago, she had lost someone she loved dearly. It was sudden, unexpected, and she had blamed herself for it ever since. People in the town tried to console her, but their words never reached the hollow space inside her heart. Only the river seemed to understand. "You speak as if you know," she said quietly, almost afraid to hear the answer. "I do," he replied. His voice was gentle, but there was a shadow in his eyes. "And yet knowing does not always make it easier. Sometimes we must face the consequences of what we've done, even if the world has forgotten them." For a long moment neither spoke. The river whispered between them, carrying the faint scent of mud and reeds, the gentle sound of flowing water masking their unspoken thoughts. She realized that he had suffered perhaps even more than she had, and that the calmness she saw in him was not absence of pain, but the strength to live with it. Over the next few days, the stranger's past began to emerge in small ways. An old scar on his hand caught her attention as he mended a broken fishing net. A brief hesitation in his voice when someone asked where he came from. A faraway look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Each clue hinted at a story that he had not yet told anyone. One morning, as the sun rose over the river, painting the water in shades of gold and pink, he shared a fragment with her while they both walked along the bank. "I made a mistake once," he said quietly. "A choice that I thought would protect someone, and it ended up causing them pain instead. I have carried it ever since." This asked Adam, surprised at his honesty. "What happened?" she asked softly. He looked away toward the distant hills, his jaw tight. "I cannot change it. Only live with it, and try to make things right in ways that I can. That is all any of us can do." Her heart ached for him because she understood that kind of pain. She had carried her own guilt for months, feeling that she had failed someone she loved. The stranger's words, though brief, resonated with her. For the first time, she did not feel alone in her suffering. There was someone who had walked through the darkness and had survived, even if he bore scars that no one else could see. Their conversations grew longer, more personal, though still cautious. They spoke of small things, the pattern of the river, the changing seasons, the habits of birds along the bank. But in the pauses between words, there was a deeper understanding forming. She began to see that his presence was not just comforting, it was healing. And perhaps, she realized, she was healing him as well. One afternoon, the young woman faced a moment she had avoided for months. She had not stepped into the river fully since the loss that had shattered her world. She had been afraid that letting herself feel again would mean being hurt once more. But standing by the water with the stranger, she felt a strange courage rising within her. I'm not sure I can do this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "You can," he said softly, his gaze steady and encouraging. "The river does not judge. It only moves forward. If you allow it, it can help carry the pain that you've held for too long." She took a slow, deep breath and stepped into the shallow water. The coolness touched her feet, sending a shiver up her spine. The stranger stayed at her side, silent but present, his eyes on her with quiet reassurance. She took another step, letting the water rise to her ankles, then knees. Her heart pounded, but she did not stop. For the first time in a long while, she felt a connection to life again, a fragile hope that she had thought lost. The stranger watched, understanding the significance of this act. He knew what it was to face the water, to confront guilt and regret, to allow oneself to feel pain fully and then release it. The river was not only a witness, it was a teacher, showing that even deep sorrow could be met with patience and quiet strength. In the evenings, they would walk back to the town together. The streets glowed under the soft light of lanterns, casting long, gentle shadows. They rarely spoke of the past in detail, yet each day brought more trust, more understanding. She began to rely on his presence, not in dependence, but in recognition that he had walked a path similar to hers and had survived. The townspeople noticed the bond forming between them, though they could not understand it fully. Some whispered, speculating about who he was and why he stayed. Others watched silently, recognizing the quiet courage in the stranger's actions. But neither the young woman nor the stranger paid attention to the gossip. Their focus was on the small steps of healing, on learning to trust again, on allowing themselves to be present in the moment. One day an old friend of the stranger appeared in town unexpectedly. She noticed the change in his demeanor, a tension that had not been there before, a shadow of anxiety crossing his face. The friend did not speak openly of the past, but the stranger's reaction made it clear that the mistakes he had carried were not yet fully behind him. He did not share the details with anyone, not even with the young woman. Yet she could feel the weight returning to his shoulders. She reached for his hand gently, a simple gesture of support, and he allowed it, grateful for her understanding. No words were needed. They had learned that presence could heal in ways language sometimes could not. Over the next week, the river became a place of quiet ritual. They would meet there each morning, often sitting side by side in silence, letting the water carry their unspoken burdens. Sometimes they would speak of lighter things, the patterns of clouds, the songs of birds, the small wonders of the world they had ignored before. In these moments, the stranger's heavy past seemed lighter, not gone but shared, and therefore more bearable. The young woman, too, began to change. Her sorrow remained, but it no longer controlled her. She laughed quietly at the stranger's dry humor, smiled at the simple beauty of the town, and allowed herself to hope for a future where her heart could be at peace. The river had taught her patience, and the stranger had taught her courage. The courage to confront pain without fear, the courage to trust again. Even as the days passed and the town continued its quiet life, the shadow of the stranger's past lingered. There were moments when his gaze would drift toward the horizon, when his hands would tighten around the railing, when his steps seemed heavier than usual. He had not yet paid the full price for his mistakes, and he knew it. But he had found a purpose in guiding her toward forgiveness, in showing her that even the deepest grief could be met with resilience and hope. And so, life continued in its gentle rhythm. The tall stranger and the young woman walked along the river, sat in its cool waters, and shared quiet moments that carried more meaning than words could express. Each day brought new challenges, new small victories, and new opportunities to heal. The town watched, often unaware of the depth of the story unfolding before them, while the river whispered its timeless lesson, that even those who have suffered most can find a path toward forgiveness and peace. By the end of this chapter in their lives, the young woman understood something important. She understood that pain could be shared without being diminished, that mistakes could be acknowledged without defining one's future, and that the river and the people who walked beside her could help her learn to forgive, slowly, patiently, and completely. The stranger, too, felt a shift within himself. In helping her, he had begun to face the parts of his past he had carried alone for too long. The process would not be quick, and the price he had paid was far from over, but he had taken the first steps toward redemption. And in the quiet moments by the river, when the water flowed and the sun dipped low, both of them knew that something fragile, beautiful, and unbreakable had begun to grow. The town was beginning to feel like home, yet for the tall stranger, a shadow lingered on the horizon. The mornings remained quiet and the river gentle, but there were moments when his gaze would drift, tense and unreadable, as if he were listening for something only he could hear. The young woman noticed these moments, though she did not ask. She had learned by now that some truths could only be revealed when one was ready to face them. One afternoon, the calm was broken. A figure appeared at the edge of the town, someone who seemed out of place, someone whose presence immediately stirred the stranger's unease. The person was older, with a sharp, piercing gaze, carrying themselves with a confidence that seemed to belong to another time, another life. The stranger stiffened, a shadow crossing his face, and his steps slowed. He had not expected to see this person here, not so soon, and certainly not in this quiet town where he hoped to find solace. The young woman watched carefully as he approached the newcomer. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight clench of his jaw, and the tightness in his hands. She had come to trust him, to see the calm strength beneath his quiet demeanor. But now she realized that there were parts of him she did not yet understand. The stranger spoke first, his voice low but firm. "I did not expect to see you here. And I did not expect to find you. the visitor replied. There was no anger in their voice, only a weight of unfinished business. A quiet reminder of the past that the stranger had carried alone for so long. The conversation was brief, careful, but every word carried significance. The townspeople, curious and cautious, watched from a distance. They did not understand the history between these two men, nor the burden the tall stranger had carried in silence. To them it was simply a moment of tension, the kind that sometimes passed without notice, but for the stranger it was a test he had been trying to avoid. After the visitor left, though not without leaving a sense of impending consequence, the stranger remained at the river longer than usual. He did not speak for a while, simply letting the water move around his feet, letting the current carry some of his unease away. The young woman joined him, carefully taking a place beside him without breaking the silence. "You knew they would come," she said softly after a while. "I did," he admitted. "But I hoped to delay it. Hoped to find some peace before facing what I could not avoid." The young woman understood. She, too, had tried to avoid facing her grief fully, had tried to hide from the pain that had consumed her for months. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm in quiet solidarity. He did not turn to her, but he did not move away either. He let her presence be a comfort, an anchor in the river's flow. That evening, the stranger spoke more of his past than he had before. He told her of a mistake, one that had cost someone dear to him, a choice he had made in fear and haste that led to pain he could never undo. He did not reveal names or places, only the weight of the consequence, the knowledge that some acts cannot be undone, only endured. "I have carried it with me," he said quietly, hoping that I might do something to balance it, to make amends in small ways. "But it is never enough." The young woman listened, her heart aching for him. She had carried her own regrets, her own feelings of failure, and she recognized the truth in his words. Pain shared did not vanish, but it became lighter, more bearable. The river, flowing endlessly, seemed to mirror this, constantly moving, constantly forgiving, yet never forgetting. Days passed, and the presence of the visitor remained in the stranger's mind. Every time he looked toward the horizon, he expected them to return, to demand reckoning for the past. Yet he continued his quiet life in the town, helping where he could, repairing boats, carrying bundles of wood, and speaking with the townspeople with gentle care. Each act was deliberate, each gesture a small step toward redemption. The young woman, too, faced tests of her own. She had grown stronger since stepping into the river, but now she was confronted with reminders of her grief that threatened to pull her back into the past. A letter arrived, a memory resurfaced, a conversation overheard, all small things, but enough to unsettle her fragile peace. She felt the familiar weight of guilt and sorrow pressing down on her, and she struggled to maintain the calm she had begun to find. The stranger noticed her unease. Without asking, he guided her to the river, as he had done before. "You do not have to carry it alone," he said softly. "The water can take some of the burden if you let it." She hesitated, but then allowed herself to step into the flowing water. The coolness touched her skin, sending a shiver through her body. But she did not retreat. She let the current brush against her hands, her feet, her legs, feeling the sorrow she had held for so long begin to loosen. The stranger stood beside her, silent, letting her take the lead, offering support only in presence. In the days that followed, the bond between them deepened. They spoke more openly, sharing not only the pain of the past, but the small joys of the present. They laughed softly at the antics of the river's birds, marveled at the colors of sunset reflected on the water, and found comfort in the quiet moments that required no words. Each shared experience strengthened their trust, each act of presence a reminder that they were not alone. Yet tension remained. The visitor's return loomed in the stranger's mind, a reminder that the past was never truly gone. He knew he could not run from it forever, and that sooner or later he would need to face the consequences fully. But he also knew that the young woman depended on him, that she had begun to trust and heal, and that his choices would affect not only himself but her as well. One morning, as the mist rose over the river, the stranger finally confronted the first direct challenge from his past. A situation arose in the town, a misunderstanding, a dispute, something that echoed the mistake he had once made. He was forced to act, to make a choice that could risk his safety, his peace, and the fragile trust he had built with the young woman. He did not hesitate. With careful courage, he stepped forward, facing the situation with honesty and integrity. He admitted mistakes were necessary, offered help where he could, and protected those who could not protect themselves. It was not an easy task, and it left him weary, but it was a necessary step. He understood that redemption required action, not simply reflection. The young woman watched, her heart pounding with both fear and admiration. She realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. She saw in him the strength to face the consequences of the past, and in doing so, she found new courage to confront her own fears. By the end of the week, the town had returned to its quiet rhythm, yet something had changed. The stranger had faced a part of his past, had acted with bravery and honesty, and had begun to earn a form of redemption that went beyond words. The young woman, too, had learned that grief could be met, that sorrow could be faced, and that the river and the people around her could help her move forward. Evenings by the river became moments of reflection. They would sit side by side, letting the water flow around them, sharing thoughts, fears, and small victories. Each ripple seemed to carry away a little more of the weight they carried. Each sound of the water a gentle reminder that life continued, that healing was possible, and that the past, while never forgotten, did not have to control the future. The stranger's presence was steady, a quiet guide through the emotional currents of the town and the river. The young woman, strengthened by his example, began to find her own voice, speaking more freely, laughing more openly, and feeling a connection to life she had thought lost. The river, ever patient, mirrored their growth, teaching them both that healing was a process, slow but inevitable, and that forgiveness, both for others and for oneself, was possible if one had courage to face the truth. And so life continued, a delicate balance of shadow and light, past and present, sorrow and hope. The stranger had faced the first challenge of his past, proving to himself that he could act with integrity. The young woman had taken steps toward confronting her grief, learning that courage and healing often walk hand in hand. Together by the river that never judged, they continued their journey, knowing that greater challenges would come, but that they had begun to find strength in each other and in the flow of the forgiving water. By the end of Part 3, both understood that the path ahead would not be easy, yet they were no longer alone in facing it. The river, the town, and each other had become witnesses to their struggle, guides through their pain, and partners in their slow, patient journey toward forgiveness, courage, and the quiet redemption that only time and honesty could provide. The days that followed the stranger's confrontation with the past were heavy with quiet tension. Even though the town had returned to its usual rhythm, he carried a lingering unease, a sense that the balance of life could shift at any moment. The visitor from before had left an imprint, a reminder that the past could never truly be left behind. And now, new challenges began to emerge, demanding that he act once again, fully and without hesitation. One morning, the town's peace was disrupted by a sudden event. A fire had broken out near the river, where some of the townspeople stored wood for the winter. Smoke rose quickly, and the flames threatened not only the supplies but also the small houses nearby. Panic spread through the town. People ran to help, shouting warnings and trying to form lines to carry water, but the fire grew faster than they could contain. The stranger's reaction was immediate. He ran toward the danger without a second thought. His long legs carried him swiftly, and his calm determination seemed to give strength to others around him. He coordinated efforts quietly but effectively, helping children and the elderly to safety, guiding people away from the worst of the flames, and moving supplies to safer areas.
The young woman followed, holding back at first, unsure how she could help.
But she could not stand aside. She remembered how he had guided her through her own pain, how he had faced his past despite fear. Now it was her turn to act. She carried buckets of water, assisted others in moving what they could, and helped the injured. Though the fire was frightening, she felt a courage she had never known before. The stranger's focus never wavered. Yet, in his determination to protect the town and the people who depended on him, he exposed himself to danger. A burning beam fell from one of the nearby warehouses, and he narrowly avoided it, pulling a young boy out of harm's way just in time. Smoke filled his lungs and heat pressed against his back, but he continued, refusing to stop until every possible danger had been minimized. Through the chaos, the townspeople began to understand the true nature of the man they had only observed quietly before. They saw his bravery, his willingness to risk himself for others, and the quiet way he put everyone else's needs above his own. No words were necessary, his actions spoke louder than any explanation could. The fire was eventually controlled, thanks in large part to the stranger's courage and leadership. Exhausted, covered in soot and sweat, he finally allowed himself to step back. The young woman rushed to him, worry evident in her eyes. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded, though the strain was clear on his face. "I'm fine," he said softly. "It's done." But the young woman could see beyond his words. She could see the cost he had paid, the physical exhaustion, the strain on his body, the emotional weight of always carrying responsibility for others. She realized then that when he had spoken of paying for his mistakes, it was not just a metaphor. He understood sacrifice in a way that few ever could, and he had lived it fully. That night the town gathered near the river, where the fire's smoke had drifted away but its memory lingered. People whispered of the stranger's courage, of the lives he had saved, and of the quiet heroism that had gone unnoticed until now. He did not seek recognition. He did not ask for thanks. He had acted because it was the right thing to do, because it was the only choice he could make. The young woman stood by his side, her heart full of admiration and gratitude. She reached for his hand, and he allowed her to hold it. In that small touch there was understanding, a recognition that they had both faced trials and had come through stronger. She realized that his bravery was not only in confronting danger but in facing the consequences of his past every day, in the quiet, ordinary acts that required courage even when no one was watching. In the days that followed, the stranger became a silent mentor for the young woman in ways she had not expected. He guided her gently, encouraging her to step further into her own strength. He showed her that courage was not always dramatic or public. Sometimes it was quiet, persistent, and personal. He encouraged her to speak to the townspeople, to share her story of grief and healing, and to understand that facing one's pain openly could inspire others. She began to practice this courage, speaking to others about the struggles she had endured. Her words were soft but honest, and the townspeople listened with respect and compassion. She found relief in sharing her experience, in realizing that sorrow could be acknowledged without being shameful, and that the river's lessons were not just for her but for everyone who had witnessed its quiet flow. Meanwhile, the stranger's own journey of redemption continued. Though the fire had allowed him to act bravely, he knew that the full cost of his past had yet to be paid. Each day he confronted small injustices, helped those in need, and made deliberate choices to protect others, often putting himself at risk. The price he had spoken of was heavy, but he bore it with patience and resolve, understanding that true atonement required more than words. It required action. The young woman observed him carefully during these days. She noticed the subtle ways he carried the weight of his past, how he flinched at sudden sounds, how he sometimes spoke in hushed tones when alone, and how he would pause for long moments, staring at the river as if seeking advice or comfort. She understood that his courage did not erase his pain. It allowed him to live with it, to face it, and to use it to help others. One afternoon she asked him quietly, "Does it ever get easier?"
He looked at her, a faint smile touching his lips.
"Not always," he admitted. But living with the consequences, facing them, and helping where you can, that is how we carry the weight. And sometimes in helping others we find forgiveness for ourselves. She nodded, feeling a quiet truth in his words. She realized that their bond was not just about shared grief, but about shared growth. They had both been broken by life in different ways, yet together they had found a path toward healing. The river had been their witness, their teacher, and their guide. Its calm flow reflected the possibility of moving forward, of releasing sorrow, and of embracing forgiveness. As the weeks passed, the town grew to rely on the stranger's quiet guidance. People came to him with questions, with problems, and even with small joys they wanted to share. He listened patiently, offered help where he could, and allowed others to see the strength that came from facing life fully, with honesty and integrity. The young woman was always by his side, learning, observing, and practicing courage in her own way. The river remained their constant companion. Each morning they walked its edge together, speaking of small things, of hopes, of the beauty around them. Sometimes they would sit silently, letting the water carry away their unspoken fears and regrets. And sometimes they would laugh softly, finding joy in the simplest of moments. A bird's song, the glint of sunlight on the water, the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. The stranger had paid a great price already, yet he knew that more might come, but he had also learned that true courage was not about avoiding pain. It was about facing it fully and honestly and using it to create something better. The young woman had learned this as well, stepping into her own strength and finding that her grief, while never forgotten, could be carried with grace and resilience. By the end of Part 4, both had grown in ways neither could have imagined. The stranger's acts of bravery and sacrifice had not only protected the town, but had also allowed him to take steps toward redemption. The young woman had found courage and hope, understanding that life's trials could be met with strength, patience, and the willingness to forgive both oneself and others. Together they stood by the river, watching the water flow endlessly, reflecting on the lessons they had learned. They knew that challenges would continue to arise, that the past would never fully disappear, and that the journey toward forgiveness and healing was ongoing. But they also knew that they had each other, that the river would remain a guide, and that the quiet strength they had discovered within themselves would carry them forward. The river was calm that morning, reflecting the pale light of dawn like a sheet of glass. Birds called to one another, their songs carrying over the water. The town itself was slowly waking, unaware that the events of this day would mark a turning point, not only for the stranger and the young woman, but for the quiet life they had both been trying to rebuild. The tall stranger stood at the riverbank, shoulders squared but heavy with thought. He had spent weeks facing the consequences of his past, protecting the townspeople and guiding the young woman through her own grief. Every act had carried a price, and now he felt the weight of it more than ever. Yet he also knew that the time had come to do what could not be delayed. Redemption required one final deliberate step, and he was ready to take it. The young woman approached quietly, noticing the tense line of his jaw and the distant look in his eyes. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly, sensing that he was preparing to face something significant. He looked at her, a faint smile touching his lips, though it did not reach his eyes. "I have to," he said. "Some debts cannot be left unpaid. Some mistakes demand acknowledgement before peace can be found." She nodded, understanding him in a way that went beyond words. She had come to see that courage and forgiveness were intertwined, that healing required confronting the past fully, no matter how painful. She had learned from him how to face her own grief, and now she could support him as he faced his. Together they walked along the river to the place where the water flowed deepest and strongest. Here, the river had always been a witness to their quiet moments, their unspoken fears, and their small victories. Now it would bear witness to a final act, one that would carry the weight of past mistakes and the hope of future peace. The stranger paused, taking a deep breath. He had prepared himself for this moment, yet even now a tremor of fear passed through him. Facing one's own past was never easy, and the knowledge that this act could change everything, or destroy the fragile trust he had built, made his steps uncertain. But he did not falter. He had come too far, and the lessons of the river, of patience and of courage, guided him forward. The young woman watched silently, offering presence instead of words. She knew that sometimes the greatest support came not from speaking, but from simply being there, letting another person carry their burden with them. Her hand brushed against his briefly, a gesture of solidarity, and he drew strength from it. The townspeople had gathered at a distance, quietly observing. They did not understand the full story, nor did they need to. They had already seen his courage, his selflessness, and his integrity in action. Now they watched as he prepared to complete his journey, knowing that something significant was about to unfold. He spoke finally, his voice carrying over the gentle flow of the river. He admitted mistakes, acknowledged the harm he had caused, and expressed regret in the simplest, most honest words. There was no grand speech, no attempt to justify himself, only truth, spoken with humility and courage. Each word felt heavy yet freeing, as if releasing the chains of the past, one sentence at a time. The young woman felt tears prick her eyes. She had witnessed his quiet strength and his sacrifices, and now she understood the depth of his journey. She also understood that forgiveness, both for oneself and from others, required honesty, vulnerability, and courage. The river reflected the sun as it rose higher, its waters moving steadily, as if affirming the possibility of renewal and peace. After a long moment of reflection, the stranger stepped closer to the water. He knelt briefly, letting his hands touch the flowing current, as if asking it to carry away the weight of his past mistakes. He whispered a few words to the river, words of apology, hope, and intention. The water lapped gently at his fingers, a quiet acknowledgement that he was ready to move forward. The young woman knelt beside him, placing her hand on the water as well. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the river's calm energy, its sense of patience, and its quiet forgiveness. In that moment, she let go of her lingering guilt, recognizing that life's hardships were part of the journey, but they did not have to define her. She could embrace hope, healing, and the possibility of joy once more. Together they rose and faced the town. The townspeople, seeing the sincerity in their eyes and the quiet strength in their posture, felt a sense of awe. They had witnessed courage, redemption, and the power of facing one's past with honesty. No words could fully capture the significance of what had happened, but the understanding was shared nonetheless. The stranger turned to the young woman. "It is time for me to leave," he said softly. "My work here is done, at least in this place. The rest must be carried forward in life in the choices we make every day." She nodded, sadness mingling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing me how to face my pain and for helping me find hope again." He smiled faintly, the first real warmth crossing his face in days. "And thank you," he replied, "for reminding me that even the heaviest burdens can be shared and that forgiveness is possible when we act with honesty and courage." He walked slowly away from the river, leaving behind the town, the young woman, and the life he had touched. The townspeople watched quietly, understanding that some people come into life not to stay forever, but to guide others, to show them the way forward, and to remind them of the strength that exists in every heart. The young woman stayed at the river for a long time after he left. She watched the water, reflecting on the lessons she had learned. She remembered the days of sorrow, the moments of fear, the acts of courage she had witnessed and participated in, and she realized that forgiveness, both for oneself and for others, was not a single moment, but a journey, a continuous process guided by courage, presence, and understanding. As evening fell, the river reflected the colors of the setting sun, vibrant and gentle. The town slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, yet the impact of the stranger's presence lingered in subtle ways. The confidence in a young woman's step, the courage of a townsman helping another, the knowledge that past mistakes could be faced and redeemed. Life continued, richer and wiser for the lessons quietly shared by the river and the man who had walked beside it. The young woman finally turned to leave, feeling a peace she had not known before. The river whispered in its steady flow, reminding her that forgiveness, hope, and renewal were always within reach. She understood that the stranger's journey had become a part of her own, and that the courage he had shown would guide her long after he was gone. In the days that followed, she often returned to the river, sitting quietly, watching the water, and remembering. She felt a connection not only to the river but to the lessons it had taught her, the strength to face pain, the importance of honesty, the quiet power of sacrifice, and the possibility of forgiveness. The town flourished around her, small acts of kindness and courage spreading quietly, inspired by the example of the stranger who had walked among them. Though he was gone, his presence was felt in every ripple of the river, every act of courage, and every step toward healing. The young woman understood that some people appear in life to guide others, to show them the path when they are lost, and then to continue their journey alone. She felt gratitude, peace, and a quiet joy in knowing that life, though full of challenges, also carried moments of profound beauty and hope. By the river, where the water moved endlessly and the sun reflected its gentle light, the story found its quiet conclusion. The tall stranger had paid the price for his past mistakes, faced the consequences fully, and guided another soul toward healing. The young woman had learned courage, forgiveness, and the power of presence. And the river, ever patient and ever forgiving, had witnessed it all, holding their sorrows, their courage, and their renewal in its timeless flow. The town would remember him not in stories of fame or grand deeds, but in the quiet courage he inspired, in the acts of kindness and honesty he exemplified, and in the young woman who had learned to live fully again. And though the stranger had walked away, leaving no trace but footprints in the soil and memories in the hearts of those he touched, his legacy lived on in every ripple of the river, in every act of bravery, and in the endless possibility of forgiveness and redemption.